Okay, folks, David Stewart here, hopefully with a little bit less strep throat than last time. I hope you guys are doing great. Today, what I thought we'd start talking about is actually world building. Had a couple requests to do more videos on world building. A long time ago, I made a video called Fantasy folks. Does Not Excuse Reality. Oops, I have a preview on there. Sorry about that. Called Fantasy Does Not Excuse Reality, and in it I talked about the importance of having a coherent setting and engaging in coherent world building in order to set up the correct set of expectations for the audience. If you don't have a coherent set of limits into what you're doing, then the audience gets starts to feel like things are just helter-skelter, like there's no order and there's no set of expectations. That reduces the tension that you can actually have with your story. World building is also something that I notice fantasy authors in particular get very into. They really like to spend a lot of time in the planning phase of a book, really designing a lot of systems to control the world that they're imagining. And if you're looking at a genre like science fiction, the world building really is the book. Because what defines science fiction is more than something nebulous like spaceships. Because with Star Wars, you're really looking at space opera. There's still lots of world building, but if you're looking at science fiction, particularly hard science fiction, it's about how ideas affect the world. So the ability to construct a coherency out of those ideas, which is going to be your world building, is absolutely critical in science fiction. It's also important in historical fiction, and you wouldn't think that historical fiction involves world building, but it actually does, and there's a couple reasons for this. The first one is that you don't live in the time that you're writing it, if you're writing historical fiction, usually, right? Usually you're writing, feudal Japan. Like I wrote a book that takes place in feudal Japan. So feudal Japan is a setting that I don't live in, and nobody lives in, so it's unfamiliar. It's also a setting in which you don't know every detail of how things were, and so you have to kind of pick and choose what's going to go into it. So you have to, in a sense, research your setting, and then you also have to build the world that you're going to occupy here by deciding what things are going to end up applying to your story. And so this brings me to my first big point before I get into lots of little details and start answering questions. Of course, you're free to chat about whatever you want. We don't have to stick on world building, but it's just a good place to start. The first big thing is your story derived from your setting? Like, do you create a completely coherent setting and you try to find a story that fits in that? Or do you alter elements of the setting to fit the needs of your story? It doesn't have to be 100% either way. Things can go both ways sometimes. In fact, they frequently do. And because if you're a story creator, you're the master of that universe, you can alter the rules to fit what you need as far as a story goes. And there's a couple ways that you can do that. Let's look at some comments before I talk about some particulars and some of the ideas that I have with world building. Let me see if I can address some of the questions that happened before the stream went live, if I can find those again. From the real Billith, who's not going to be here today. Suppose that in my fantasy world some basic things do not exist, for example, fire. How do I show that through indirect exposition? Because characters would have no concept for it, but I don't want to use direct exposition. Direct exposition is saying, like, in this world there is no fire, right? Just kind of saying how things are. Well, if there's no fire, what are the things that you would do with fire? Well, you cook with fire. Fire provides light. Fire scares away wild animals. Like, those are three big ones, right? That fire is so essential that part of banishment in Rome is that nobody could give you fire or water for so many miles around Rome. Like, I think it was several hundred leagues around Rome. No one could give you fire or water because those are the two essential things for life. If you have fire, you can cook your food and you can keep wildlife away. And if you have water, you won't go thirsty. So those are like the most, or food, water, and fire. So fire is essential. Well, you just show your characters doing the things that fire would require without fire. Now, just as an example, in our modern world, many people live without fire. Now, they have a concept for fire because fire exists in our past, but lots of people don't use fire ever. So they wake up in the morning and they turn on the light, and they have an electric light. Then they get out of bed and they're like, it's cold, and they turn on their heater, and it's an electric heater. Then they go into their kitchen to make themselves some eggs, and they turn on their electric stove. So electricity, the magic of electrons, is powering their world. And so if you were to just look at it indirectly, somebody going through their life, they would never use that fire, right? They don't use it for light, for water. And of course, wild animals don't really exist in modern cities. At least they're not any kind of danger when they, like raccoons, there's like raccoons in El Segundo, which is right by the airport in LA where I used to live there. So we had raccoon problems. That was the problem. You couldn't have a koi pond because the raccoons would eat all the koi. That's the wild animal problem that people in the cities, not like a lion coming down from the hills and devouring you, right? And you need fire to scare it away. So that's what I would probably do for something like that, just as an example. You just show the things that people would normally know are associated with something like fire, and they're doing something else, like they're using magic to cook their water or whatever they're going to do. And that's the way that you can do that. Some other people, would you consider doing something? He's mentioned, please rewind has mentioned interest in doing a regular collab show or podcast with you. I would do it. I like him a lot, and I like his content. Problem is, I'm really bad on staying up to date with like movies. Like I haven't gone to a movie in quite some time because I've been so busy, and because kids, right? So I really wanted to go see Mortal Engines because I just wanted to see another crazy Peter Jackson fantasy film. But I couldn't get to the movies because life was too demanding around the holidays. It just is. And it's really hard to, like, I can't take my son to something like that. He's 3. So I have to leave him at home. And then, you can only leave your wife at home with the kids so often. Or I take my wife and pay for babysitting, and that's an expense that is really expensive. It's not something I can afford to do all the time, is to hire babysitters. Or have to trade off with, like, my brother-in-law, his kids about the same age. So, like, we could trade off nights, but that's sometimes hard to arrange. You guys know how it is if you have kids. So that's the only problem, is, like, I don't know what I would talk about because I don't keep up to date with a lot of shows. Like, I don't watch TV. Barely go to the movies these days. It's kind of hard for me to keep up with it all. All right, let's see if there's any. Music's pretty awesome. Thank you, Jerry. That's one of my songs. I try not to. This is from Glitchy Gear. I try not to create explicit magic systems for my fantasy. But I usually find my events are more character and moral focused, so such details can actually hamper me a bit. So that's very classic. If you read something like, I think I have a copy here. If you read something like Elric, like this is Vanishing Tower. I really like this Elric book, actually. I think my favorite's probably Stormbringer, but or the first one. First and the last are always the good ones. But Elric's a sorcerer, but we don't quite know how his sorcery works or what its limits are. It mostly serves as a way to kind of progress him forward and to provide him some power to overcome certain things. It's not essential to what the story is really about, which is about Elric's decisions morally. So in classic fantasy, the idea of highly systematized magic is somewhat contemporary. Ursula Le Guin had a pretty systematized version of magic in the Earthsea books, and in fact, most authors borrow heavily from her. So if you're looking at like the Harry Potter books, for instance, they're literally just the first Earthsea book, but like set in Britain, like including the exact same magic system, pretty much, but without nearly as interesting a set of ideas that surround them. Not that Harry Potter's bad; it's just not. There's just not as much to it in terms of the moral sensibilities and the themes that are within the Earthsea books. And the Earthsea books are basically kids' books, and they didn't shy away from having more heavy themes in kids' books. Now there's more complicated plots, but it used to be that there was more interesting ideas. I don't know. Like, I feel like a lot of ideas have disappeared from literature, and it's been replaced by just kind of rote craft. Like, here's a plot, here's a setting, here's some characters that interact with each other, and there's nothing deeper at stake. And maybe that kind of reflects the nihilism that's that's kind of taken over our culture. I don't know. But anyway, so that one was highly systematized, and most people tend to copy that one. It had like basically a primal language that controlled magic, you know. So if you read Name of the Wind, the magic system is literally just a ripoff of what Ursula Le Guin in Earthsea, almost like down to the word, you know. There's different words, but this idea that you control the wind by naming the wind, that's straight out of Wizard of Earthsea. It's not remotely original, just so you know. So a lot of people copy that, and my magic system is somewhat like that. But instead of looking at words, it's concept-based. So really, it's your ability to form a connection with concepts in what I would call Platonic realm. But so if you avoid an explicit magic system, then you can't really have magic be the focus of what you're doing too much. You know, it needs to be focused on other things, which have definable limits. So one of the things in Lord of the Rings is that there's no defined magic system, but none of the main characters are magicians. So the magic is kind of hovering on the outside of the setting and not really at the beck and call of the main characters as they navigate their way through the plot. So if you have a less defined magic system, it's a really good idea to have the main characters, which are the focus of the story, not have full access to that. And actually, there's a bunch of different iterations I can give you for that, besides just like Elric. Harry Potter. We'll go back to Harry Potter. So you notice the kids don't know any magic. They're learning magic, and the adults have tons of magic. That means the adults can basically be fit into whatever square they need to be fit into. They can fill whatever need. The all-powerful adult wizards can do whatever you need them to do, and the kids can only have a couple of things that the author has shown them knowing how to do, really available for them to use as far as magic. And so in this way, it highly limits the possibilities of the characters and what they can do. So it creates some very firm limits on what the story can do, while at the same time having no limits for the obstacles you can create for them. And if she had had a very well-defined magic system, then you wouldn't have seen as much diversity in the books as they went on. And a lot of people, it's kind of like a magic trick. And one of the problems with these like new Harry Potter movies is that because you switch the focus from people who don't know magic to people who do, it just feels helter-skelter. It feels like there's no limits and things. Anything could happen at random at any time for any reason. And it's mostly, you spend a lot of dialogue stopping and trying to explain to somebody what just happened, or trying to find a way to explain to the audience that this was magic and that's possible. Whereas you just didn't have to do that when you had kids involved with it. It just wasn't an issue at all. So there's some things to think about with that. And Star Wars is a good example too. So Star Wars, Luke is a learner throughout most of Star Wars, which means you can kind of add powers as you need them to go backwards. Kind of create force powers that fit what you need for the plot, like telepathy or sensing other people, whatever it needs to be. George Lucas could just be like, well, he could tell this from the Force, right? In the prequels, it's a lot more defined. Not just because you have full-fledged Jedi and Sith running around, but also because between Return of the Jedi and when Phantom Menace came out, there's 15 years worth of material that came out that a lot of casual fans are just not aware of, that really, pushed the limits of what the Force could do and really kind of defined how that would work. And the prequels kind of fit a lot into that, especially if you watch something like the Clone Wars, which is not, that's in the prequel era stuff. It kind of fits into a much more defined magic system. So it has a little bit different feel when you watch the prequels, because you have a better idea of what the Force does. Now we go to the sequels, and they didn't really understand that when they were writing the sequels and producing those. So they would conjure up Force powers out of the abyss, like stopping a blaster bolt. And it would be okay to expand the magic system if there was some explanation. So when they did expand it, like in the EU, it was like a discovery of some old Force power. There's things like that. So, you add powers and then you have characters learn things through nothing. You have Rey does a mind trick having never learned it. And so that breaks this immersion, because by the time we finish the prequels, they have this idea that there's a defined magic system to Star Wars. Even though it wasn't very defined in the first three, it was pretty defined by the end of the prequels. And so when you start breaking those rules, it's very obvious to people who've been paying attention. So that's something that you want to... If you can do one or the other, you can go from undefined to defined, but after you've defined it well, you got to stay within those limits too. My biggest problem is a single habitat planet of Star Wars. Totally. If you think too deeply about it, that's something I've complained about. It's like there's the desert planet, and there's the ice planet, and there's the forest moon of Endor. Like everything's a single biome, whereas that thing's like as diverse as Earth, and that's something that you'd probably have to deal with if you were thinking about science fiction. So I read a sci-fi book, and the planet that it's on is tidally locked. So there's like a hot side and a cold side, and kind of the middle of the planet, it's kind of eternally twilight, and you can live there, right? And so that creates a very different set of living standards, a very different world. That would be a single biome for the people living there. But if you have a planet that's going to be more like Earth, then you should expect some pretty diverse biomes. You might have a planet that's colder and it's much narrower where you can live or something like that, but chances are you wouldn't just have an ice planet that you lived on, or a planet that's entirely forest, because you have climates that happen whenever you have a planet-sized body. That's a great point. It says, how's it going? It's going good. I don't have strep throat this week, so that's better. How would you do a sci-fi setting where the more advanced military faction uses firearms for small arms, while its less capable competitors use energy guns? I don't know. I don't know how I would do that. Yeah, I don't know. It would just be, how do those weapons affect the tactics that those two different cultures and militaries operate under? So if you're using energy guns, do they have a defined range? What's their firing capacity like? How accurate are they? How quickly does a projectile travel? How much randomization does it have when it hits a person? And then from there, you decide on the tactics. So maybe energy weapons have a shorter range, but they're highly more randomizing. They're like a phaser, right? So if you have your one faction has firearms, obviously they're firing a projectile. They can fire it maybe from a greater distance, but it has less randomizing potential. Whereas the energy guns can like destroy tanks. They can destroy armor. They're more destructive, but they're shorter range, right? So then from there you could create some interesting scenarios and kind of figure out how things are going to work from there. Or maybe the energy weapons, like they have a really wide arc. So obviously, if you're fighting with an energy weapon, a firing line is really essential. If someone gets ahead in the firing line, you're gonna have friendly fire and they're gonna die, right? So you have to think about what those weapons do, and then you create it from there. So this is part of creating a coherent world, and this is some things that I want to get to. When you come up with one idea, that idea kind of cascades into a bunch of different effects for how things are. So energy weapons, like what do the energy weapons do? What do they look like? How do they operate? And then how does that change everything? That's like kind of the essence of science fiction. So, if you had a science fiction environment where everybody can communicate telepathically, which we already have that. Like we're communicating telepathically right now a little bit. But let's imagine you have like a Borg, right? Well, how would the Borg society look like? How would it operate? What would, you start coming up with a bunch of different consequences of that world change. I've recently discovered lit RPG. Seems difficult to write in, but so much fun to read. Have you ever considered writing in that genre before? I've never read a lit RPG book, and I don't really know what they are. And the idea seems really ridiculous to me. So I probably wouldn't write in that genre. I'd probably write the books that I really want to write. But maybe if I read one sometime and I think they're interesting, I'll write one in that genre. To me, it seems rather bizarre. It'd be like writing furry fiction or something. Like just not something that I'm not part of that. I don't know what that is, really. Do Do you have some key tips for writing believable and interesting political systems in fantasy and sci-fi? I was going to use the concepts and type of people from history, but just wondering if there are some aspects that are important to convey to others without boring the audience. I have a super chat. Jake, I'll get to your question in just a second. Let's do the super chat first. Where do you start with world building, universe building, especially for video game design and story integration? You got to start with the environment, probably. So if you think of that pyramid setting, it's probably going to start with environment. So what's the environment like? You know, does this take place in some sort of hostile ice world like Hoth? Does it take place in an environment that's pretty familiar to our own? And then what are going to be the adaptations to it? Do you want magic? Do you not want magic? Usually because we're talking about world building, we're thinking of like geography as well. So from there, you kind of start with, really geography is a separate concern, but you kind of start with what the environment's like and how people adapt to thrive in that environment and to make themselves prosperous with whatever magic. And then you define limits. So if you think about possibilities, all possibilities probably need to come with some sort of limit that you can define. So maybe people have fire magic, right? Like they can conjure fire. But maybe they can't conjure fire underwater, obviously, right? Or they can't conjure fire if they're too tired. I don't know. So you start coming up with some limits for it that just creates a defined path for how they're going to use it. And with those limits in mind, when you start constructing the plot, obviously some plot points are possible that wouldn't be possible without magic, and some ones are not possible because of the limits that you put on them, and that's really what you want. The virtue of fantasy is that it creates a different set of possibilities for a story and for a character and the way they operate. And then from that setting, of course, then you generate characters, right? So if you have a setting and you're thinking about society, right? So society's adaptation, a lot of society is an adaptation to how you're going to survive in your environment. So if you live in a very cold place, obviously society needs to revolve around how you're going to stay warm and get your food. And so from there, that dictates how social interactions are going to happen. How social interactions are going to happen is going to dictate the attitudes of your character. If your character's a rebel, he's going to rebel not against the social norms that we have, but against the social norms that exist in his society. So if you imagine a society of, I don't know, nudists or something like that, and they obviously they have a particular way of living, and you can describe that. And if you have someone that's going to rebel against it, he's like, I've come up with this thing called clothes that make you more aesthetically appealing, and that's heresy or something, right? So you could write a story about that, which is kind of an inversion of how we have it now, like an imposition of modesty for reasons other than modesty. Like clothes look good, or clothes have a function, and it's maybe the society views clothes as heresy. So you could start with something like that. For video game design, it really you have to think about your gameplay. It should really start with gameplay. So if you have a bunch of gameplay features, those are going to be part of your world building. So if you have a character, maybe you're going to make a side-scrolling like Metroidvania type game, and your character attacks with a sword. So he's not going to be Simon Belmont. He's going to attack with a sword, right? So if he attacks with a sword, what does that mean about the world? That means the world probably uses swords, right, rather than guns. If he attacks with a gun, then the world is going to be more like ours because there's guns involved. The abilities are there. If the character can double jump, is that magic, right? So maybe he has like a magical capacity in the world. Can he cast the spell? Okay, well, it's a world full of wizards. So every ability that you add into your game, every gameplay element is part of the world building. And so from that world building, then you're going to decide on how that's going to create a society, and it's going to create a social organization, and how that's going to affect the characters. So if we look at Dragon Age as an example, and I've played all the Dragon Age games, but I try to pretend there's only one, which is Dragon Age Origins. If we look at Dragon Age, you have mages, right? So mages can do all kinds of magic. Their limits of the magic are determined by the gameplay elements that are there. Oh, I have a blood magic tree. That lets me use my blood as like a source of magical power. I have to use lyrium to restore my magic. So you have all of these world building elements just built into the gameplay of mage or Templar, because then it's like, okay, well, mages are really powerful. What would society do with this really powerful group of people that also are capable of being possessed by demons, right? So you add this element, demons really want to possess them. Well, they put them in a tower to keep society safe from the mages. That way they can control the mages. And then how do we control the mages? We got to create an order of knights that are immune to magic. So you create Templars, which have the ability to resist the magic and control the mages. And then from there, you generate a story. The story is, oh, you're a tower mage, and now you're going to escape the tower for these reasons, right? And you create a story that comes out of that. And so if you look at the entire world building of Dragon Age, even the second and third games, starts with this idea of mages. So it starts with mages as a gameplay element. That becomes a world building element that transforms into a world where magic has a certain view, and there's beings that exist to counter that magic. And of course, like the Templar is a class, so you can use it in the gameplay. So the gameplay and the story are intermixed. And it's the gameplay elements, it's the way that you generate characters that creates the world building elements, that sets the limits and creates the possibilities for all the story that you're going to do. And then eventually you have your entire universe is built on just this one idea and all the cascading consequences. And then your plots can revolve around those as well. So when big stuff happens with the Chantry and the way the Chantry controls the mages, so all that stuff is related to gameplay. So really you start with gameplay and then you design the world to match what you want the gameplay to have. That's probably the way that I would do it. And I think the best, of course, I'm talking about a complicated RPG, but even something like Mario, right? Even something like a Mario game. He jumps and he shoots fire, so there's magic, obviously. And so he's fighting turtles, so the boss is going to be a big spiky turtle, like a snapping turtle that can breathe fire. You end up having a bunch of weird little things that just kind of make sense based on what the gameplay was. Well, he's going to save a princess. The princess must be locked in a dungeon, which means there must be a castle, which means there must be, it kind of cascades from there. So, and that's a really simple set of game design principles, but hopefully you can see what I mean there. Thanks for that question. That's a great question. Let me talk for a minute. Actually, let me answer Jake's question if I can find it again. I don't know if I can. Jake Uyeda, writing believable, interesting political systems. So, going from history. Again, it's starting with what is different, and then how is that going to affect things. So like with Dragon Age, you had magic, and then that created a political system based on how you needed to control that. I think it's great to look at historical examples for political organization, because you see some certain patterns that repeat, right? You see the organization of people into their ethnicities and their tribes and things like that. And you also see certain ways of organizing empire, the way that empires exact tribute from other tribes. You see the sort of the Roman style competition between different empowered areas of the polity. And you even have city-state competitions. The organization of city-states in ancient Greece kind of repeats itself with the city-states in medieval Italy, right? You get a repetition of ideas that happen throughout time. A feudal system might be a good place to start if you wanted to think about one, or you could think about anything. Like, is it an imperial system? Is it a feudal system? So like feudal Europe and feudal Japan, they're both called feudal for a reason. They had pretty similar systems. They're different. Obviously, they're very different. But as far as the way that this hierarchy works, going up to kind of a central monarch, a shogun, or a king, which is really a warlord, they're pretty similar. So that's probably where I would start with that. So let me say a couple things about creating believable worlds. For a world to be believable, it has to be internally coherent. Internal coherency is the most important thing. And anything which is not explicitly stated in your world building whether you do it indirectly or directly. Anything that's not explicitly there, people are going to assume the normal rule applies. So if space wizards can jump higher than normal people, that's because they're space wizards. And if they're not space wizards, then they can't. They can only jump as high as normal people. So if you had seen Han Solo jump onto a roof, you would have been like, what? Right? But if we see Luke jump onto a roof, it's not a big deal. Okay, so that's something that is important, is that you default to what the normal expectation is with anything. Some people get really heavy into world building and start designing every little aspect. And there's nothing wrong with this, because the goal when you're world building, and I might make a separate video on this because I've answered so many questions at the beginning. The goal when you're world building is to make a setting which is interesting and compelling on its own. This is for fantasy and sci-fi and for historical fiction. A lot of reasons people read historical fiction is for the the historical period that's there. So it needs to be interesting. But it also has to be coherent. So how do you get those two to align? In some cases, they go against each other. If you create a society of nudists in ice, obviously that makes no sense. And people will kind of get turned off from that. But there's some things that seem perfectly reasonable to an author, which are nonsense to people who know anything. I'll give you an example from popular fiction in the Stormlight Archive by Brandon Sanderson. Now, this is the first book, at least, I think is really good. The other two books, I'm not as big a fan of because I think their story execution is just way slower, and so it's just not nearly as good as that first book. But the world building is really good, especially in the first book, and the way he does it kind of indirectly shows you a lot about what's possible. And a lot of it is these cascading ideas. So instead of regular money, they trade these little crystal gem chips like encased in spheres of glass. And they have to be charged with stormlight, which is like this magic light that comes from these magic storms, right? Now, anyone who knows anything about economics knows that this is not a system of money. And that's because little spheres with crystals in them are neither fungible nor divisible, which makes them terrible money. So money has to be a store of value, fungible, and divisible. So they might be a store of value, like diamonds could be a store of value, but they're not divisible because if you cut a diamond in half, you reduce its value by more than half. So it's not divisible. Whereas if you cut a piece of gold in half, it's worth exactly half as much. So gold is divisible, whereas, diamonds are not. And they're also not fungible because you have one that's really colorless and one that has a lot of flaws. And so the fungibility of these is just kind of imposed upon it. It's just, don't look too hard at this, the fact that all these crystals are obviously different in size, shape, quality, and wouldn't be valued the same. They're non-fungible. But the monetary system was created out of a consequence because one of the things with one of the magic systems in the Stormlight Archive is that you can transmute matter. You can change matter from one thing to another. So gold may not be a great source of money because you could just change a rock into a piece of gold, and then you have more gold. So if you can magically create more of the money, then you need to create something where you magically can't create more of it. This was something that Star Trek had. So let me transition to Star Trek as we talk about money systems. So anyway, in other words, I don't think this money system is that bad, but it clearly would not actually work as money. And you have to kind of suspend your disbelief and say like, well, fiat currency would be more believable. And chances are Brandon Sanderson is not like a monetary theorist or an economist or anything. I was just thinking of a cool way to have money. Have money that was different from gold and silver, and because his characters might be able to create gold and silver, he might have thought that as a problem. But he also has grown up under fiat currency. But most people don't know what real money is anymore because we have these little paper monies that are Federal Reserve notes or from whatever central bank, wherever you happen to be, and don't really relate to any actual fungible, divisible, store of value piece of metal, right? Metallism. So I don't count it as bad. A lot of people think that it's like a great detail. I'm like, I think it's not as good because I know that it's not real money, and it wouldn't function very well as money. But if we look at Star Trek, you have gold-pressed Latinum, which is this currency that is kind of created. I want to say it was done in Deep Space Nine, but it might have been done before that. And the currency was created because they realized that, Gene Roddenberry's vision of like a moneyless society just wasn't going to fly with the Ferengi, and it wasn't going to fly in interstellar commerce. The whole idea of trading means that you need some medium of exchange for that to happen. So they kind of threw Gene Roddenberry's pipe dream out the window and created a currency called gold pressed Latinum. And gold pressed Latinum is just made up because they have this thing called replicators, and replicators can just make a cup full of tea for you. Tea, Earl Grey, cold. They can make gold. So you needed something that replicators couldn't make. And they're just like, replicators can't make this. Now it's worth money. So anything that can't be replicated all of a sudden has value, which is an interesting thought too. And so that's a consequence of trying to, it's a problem solution to the way that you've constructed technology. You've constructed technology that's so advanced it could just make cups of tea. But if it's so advanced it can make cups of tea, it could just make money. All right, let's see if we can get to some questions. Is it okay to introduce powers to solve problems if it's in a low-stakes situation, i.e. the hero fights bandits who clearly aren't going to be a major threat and they use a new power? Any power you introduce, the reader's going to be aware it can be used later. So just keep that in mind. You can introduce it through low-stakes things, that it's possible to do things. In fact, that would be an indirect exposition. Like bandits attack early in the story, and the wizard's like, I got this, guys. And he's like, and like lights them all on fire. In fact, actually, I have a scene that does that in Needle Ash. Basically does what you're talking about. So in this, there's some magic that's explained in the middle of battle at the beginning, and it's reiterated in a scene where they come across some bandits, basically some highwaymen. And the main character here, Michael, he knows what's up. And so he says, by the way, you can buy this paperback right now. The ebook comes out on Friday, I think. So you can pre-order it if you want. Has the full story, all 3 books if you haven't read them, all in one handsome volume to sit next to Water of Awakening. If you guys want to read my fantasy, you don't have to. You don't have to read my books to know me. So the bandits attack, and my mage character in this, Sharona, she all of a sudden they are like doubled over in horrific pain. And they're like, Michael's like, well, that was cool. How'd you do that? And she's like, well, I made them feel like they were being stung by bees. Because I can make people, as long as I know something really well, I can bring it forth into the real world. I can iterate it. And I know what it's like to be stung by a swarm of bees. And it's like, well, that sucks. It's like, yeah, but it comes in handy. I can make people feel like bees are stinging them. Right? And so later in the book, of course, she's able to use similar powers like that. And there's a really kind of a sad way that she uses one that kind of harkens back to that. So you kind of set it up as a possibility, and then you can use it again later. That would be a great way to do it. And you can do it indirectly. Oh yeah. Warner Brother keeps screwing up is where they should have exercised executive control. As for, I think we're talking about Fantastic Beasts. Rowling is not a screenwriter, so she wrote the screenplays, and I don't know if they ever hired anyone to doctor them. And the creative team is incompetent. So here's a problem, though. I'm just going to tell you that this is an actual thing. In Hollywood, they will have multiple people doctor a screenplay. A screenplay will get rewritten like a dozen times before it gets produced. So many times that, I met a guy down there named Paul Allen, and like one of the things he did was he negotiated credit rights. And so what he would do is he would negotiate who was going to be listed as the writer, because so many people will have rewritten a screenplay, it was no longer clear who had written it. So I don't know how many people rewrote that and didn't end up on credits. So just because no one else is on the credits doesn't mean anyone didn't doctor it. But that may have been like part of the way that they set that up, is it's going to be her screenplay, and it's going to be the way her, she does it. And if you don't, Stephen King has written his own screenplays, and they've turned out pretty good. But I think he's also a little bit more just a more experienced writers for us doing lots of different stuff. So there was, they probably should have stepped in and said like, okay, with this first one, and be like, this is not going to film well. These things we need to change. Now, either you can change them, or we'll hand this off to somebody who can change them for us. We'll hand them off to like Joss Whedon or someone who does this all the time, and he'll fix it all for us. And just kind of presented that, and it probably would have come out better. That's totally off topic, but it's a great point. If you have, and here's the thing about that I wanted to get to. If you rewrite something enough times, it becomes bad. It just does. So like The Last Action Hero with Arnold Schwarzenegger was rewritten like 20 times, and at the end of it, it was bad. And if you read the original screenplay, it's really funny. It's intended to be something that's very comedic and campy, kind of like True Lies. Same thing with Snow White and the Huntsman. I think that was rewritten 17 times. And at the end of it, you get a movie that just doesn't have any kind of impact because there's no artistic thumbprint. There's no one single mind that's trying to reiterate the themes and trying to construct things the way that they want them to do. It's all about trying to dial it in so that everyone will like every bit of it. What you end up at the end of it is just kind of a gray mess. So having too many people rewrite, I think, comes out really bad. I find Japanese fiction gets around a very soft magic system pretty well by way of giving the characters a small and very well understood list of powers. Yeah, that's kind of how I do with mine. Now, the main characters aren't magical, right? But the enemy is a bit magical. He's a demon. How did you get strep throat? I think I got the flu, and it was like a secondary infection somehow. So that's how it was. So last week, yeah, I'm surprised I got through it, but finally went to the doctor on Friday. I'm like, sore throat's not going away. He's like, well, you got strep throat. So we're going to shoot you full of antibiotics and send you on your way. And then, of course, that same day, my son was in the hospital because he was throwing up so bad from the flu. He got dehydrated. We had to give him an IV and antiemetic and all this stuff. He was very good about it. So I bought him some Legos or something, the next day when I was out getting his prescriptions. But it's really scary when you have to take your kid to the hospital and he actually needs to go to the hospital. Little kids can get dehydrated really fast. So it's been bad. And then my wife has bronchitis, all from the same flu. So we all got the flu, and I think we had flu shots this year too, and it didn't do anything. I've been working through a couple of short stories around a central character. I want them to be concise, but I find that the larger mythical and universe elements are trying to creep in. Yeah. I understand that. I'm dealing that with a novella I'm writing right now that I'm going to come out with hopefully in a couple days on Subscribestar. What elements I want to bring in and what elements I want to keep out. So I would say, and this is what I'm doing, I'm trying to focus on one small dichotomy of important elements and just really hammering those home and leaving everything else out if I can. Or just having it be set in a way that the magic isn't really plot important, which is true. How might I negotiate those around the more crucial and immediate detail in a short story format? Robert E. Howard does this really well, I think. Just don't worry about the magic. Make sure the magic isn't operating in a way that just saves the character out of nowhere. Magical opponents that you then have to cut their head off of. It's fine. You don't have to explain all the magic. Just let that go. How important, so this is from Kaku. This is a great question because I do this. How important is establishing myths within your world build story? And let me answer this one and then I'll answer your super chat. We all operate with myth as a background. Everyone does. And even in ways that you may not be aware of. So if you're an American, you operate under an American mythology. And most people don't like to think about Americans as being like having an American mythology, but we do. Our American mythology centers around not just the stories of how America started, some of which are completely folkloric, not just ideas of like the Pilgrims, but ideas about what America means on a mythological level. So like what the United States means. You hear people who are a little bit more black-pilled or red-pilled talking about magic dirt. This idea that people come to America and the magic dirt makes them Americans, right? because there's this idea that people come to the land of the free for opportunity. This is all it's all mythological, but the myth affects your behavior and the myth iterates itself into the world. America is a land of opportunity because people believe it's a land of opportunity. It's kind of like a mindset thing. So you come to America with this idea that I'm going to exercise my own power and be an entrepreneur and have a business and be economically successful. And lo and behold, you are. And in fact, most immigrants who stay here are pretty economically successful, especially compared to the same kind of person where they came from. It is almost like magic dirt, but it's all mythology. It's all up here. And now this is a weird thing to think about, but when you put it in a story, it's the same idea. Your myths affect the way that you think. So if you're looking at ancient Romans, there's this concept called mos maiorum, the proper way, like the good path, the orthodoxy of Roman tradition, which is based on their mythological beginnings as a society, how the first kings were, how the Senate developed. All of that affects their political organization and violating those unspoken constitutions. They had a constitution that was unwritten. Violating that was big, and people operated under those things. The idea that it's honorable to be a warrior, it's honorable, that's all part of mythology. So the mythology is so important when you're world building, whether you're writing in a historical sense or you're writing fantasy or you're writing science fiction. The mythology that surrounds what we do. Often we tend to think of myths as like, oh yeah, stories about Thor and Zeus, rather than what the meaning of them is. What's the meaning of Odin paying an eye for a drink of mead to gain wisdom? What does that mean? Well, the meaning behind it is that essentially to become wise has great costs to you. And Odin has to trade an eye in order to gain the knowledge that he seeks. And when he gains the knowledge that he seeks, it also changes him. It changes his outlook. So, there's deep things there that affect everything about what you do, right? The concept of Hades or Sheol as places where the dead go, and where the dead go when they die, right? Like, so in Norse mythology, the Einarjar, the warriors that go to Valhalla, the honorable dead, these are people who sacrificed themselves in battle for honorable reasons, and therefore were chosen to be warriors in the afterlife. How does that affect somebody who goes into battle? Well, it's all important. The idea that people are willing to die for their country, people are willing to die rather than to let Rome fall. Constantine the 16th fought on the walls of Constantinople, even though he was sure to die, and he died fighting alongside his men as the last emperor of the Roman Empire. Why did he do that? Well, he did that because he had a deep faith about not just what he was as a Christian, but what Rome was. That it would be better to die than to live without Rome. That Rome gave him his life, and if Rome demanded his life, he would have to give it. Like, that's the depth of mythology. So it's very important to think about that. But it can be in the background, right? And so for my stories, it's a lot of the myth is kind of in the background, and it's done indirectly because that's the way that we experience myth. We don't sit around and talk about the mythology of magic dirt in America. It kind of infuses what we do, this belief that you come to a free place and you can be as successful as you want to be, and as long as you work hard, you'll gain wealth and power. It's mythological at a very profound level. And of course, Star Wars is mythology. It's all mythology. You mentioned Brandon Sanderson more than a lot. I read the one book up until the guy is a slave carrying bridges. I got bored and quit reading. It kept bouncing around from one character to another. Yeah, there's a lot of characters. It gets good at the end. It's up to you whether you want to continue on. Honestly, I'd be happy just having read the other two Stormlight books, just kind of leaving it. This is Brandon Sanderson's problem. He brings in a lot of characters that just don't carry the weight. They're just not as interesting or compelling or likable as they need to be to have a place in a epic story. And so I mean, Robert Jordan maybe suffered from this. Like with Wheel of Time, there's so many characters, some of them you're bound to hate or be bored with. And you end up just getting kind of bogged down trying to deal with character progression. That's what happened in the latter two books. And in fact, you could probably cut a third out of the first book. If you cut everything with Shawnee out of the first book, you wouldn't lose anything really in the effect. So I try to avoid that personally. So one of the things I do with my books is rather than bouncing around from character to character in different places and trying to tell like 8 stories at once, I'm like, this is one story with one set of characters and you never leave them until the end. This is a different story with a different set of characters and you never leave them till the end. And the third book will be another story, actually with some of the characters from each, but you never leave them until the end. You don't bounce around between unrelated different things very much. That's something in a lot of epic fantasy that can be, that's where it gets bogged down, is somebody's like, I don't know why this is relevant, it's not interesting. If I wanted to read a book about Shawnee, I would expect you would just write one about her, So anyway. Okay. Adam Tim says, I missed a super chat. Tips on, I'm sorry, what super chat did I miss? First, let's do Kaku. Myths, are they important to incorporate in your world and build your story? Be thought out from scratch or loosely based upon the ones that actually existed? Yeah, so I think I answered that. It's about what they mean to people. So if you have a society of warrior monks, what's the mythology that creates that? And they can refer to it often. So I refer to mythology often in Muramasa. That's historical mythology. But it's how people express the meaning of it that matters. And that's the thing that is important. It's not just how the world was made or, what god dipped his Yari into the ocean and brought it to Japan. That doesn't matter. And what matters is what that means for the people that are in it. Gangi Films, tips on world building around artifacts like the One Ring. So I'm kind of, I'll be coming out with a novella pretty soon on, this will come out on Subscribestar for free, and then later I'll probably put it out as a 99-cent ebook. And once I get around to either buying or designing a cover for it, depending on my budget and how much money I think I'll make from it. Has an artifact, a very important artifact. So you have to think about, does the artifact build the world, or is the artifact an element of the world? And in what ways could the artifact affect the world? So the One Ring has the power to influence minds and to order, Sauron would use it to control and keep the orcs under his will. So it's a weapon of will. And one of the interesting things about the Ring of Power is that the only person who can really wield it appropriately is a god. It's really Sauron, right? It's designed to express his power rather than the power of man. But man gets tempted by it, thinking that he could. Like, could I use this ring to control the orcs or weaken them, to set the world in the way that I want to? He's expressing Sauron's desire, but he doesn't have Sauron's power to wield it. So there's an interesting element there. That's a big part of the Lord of the Rings story. But you can think of other artifacts, like maybe, there's like Final Fantasy, there's like crystals, and there's 4 crystals that hold up the world, and those 4 crystals each affect some magic, right? So if you take the crystal out of where it's supposed to be, does that kill everybody's magic, right? I don't know. You have to, you got to be kind of original with it. From a game design perspective, because you asked about game design earlier, look at what other games have done. So, maybe you have one of my favorite JRPGs, which is actually Golden Sun, which is a Game Boy Advance JRPG, but a really good one, a really fun one from back in the day. You have these 4 like elemental stones, and they're locked away inside this weird sanctuary, and there's some characters trying to break in and get them. So if they get them, then they're going to be able to gain like this super alchemical power. So you set that up. So the conflict is centered around, can you stop them from doing that? And the powers, therefore, are derived from the system. You have these artifacts that now they're trying to light these lighthouses with them, trying to bring alchemy back in the world, which will change the powers that affect the world. But then you find out the world's dying because it doesn't have alchemy anymore, and so it's like there's so much that goes into it. But it all just starts with this idea of like this artifact that locks away this magic power. And you can start from there. So obviously people would want to have the magic power, but if you unleash the magic power, then that changes the nature of society. There's lots of different ways to go about it. You kind of have to think about it from an original perspective. If it's something that could destroy the world, obviously it must either be destroyed or be protected. So maybe a mythical guardian protects an object that can destroy the world, or there's an object that can destroy the world like the One Ring and they have to destroy it. You could also look at an artifact like the Silmarils in the Silmarillion by Tolkien, which are coveted simply because they're amazingly beautiful. And they're so prized and treasured that these elves and gods are willing to fight wars over them. That's just, there's nothing magical about it, but it is an artifact that kind of controls what people want. They bind their oaths based on these Silmarils. But I would probably start with something like, what does the artifact need to do? So if the artifact is going to destroy the world, then you either have to destroy it or you have to preserve it. You have to keep it safe. And then you go from there. Are there guardians that guard it? Do the heroes have to go save it and steal it away? What are you going to do? From Tree Rock Creations, I seem to have problems with trading dialogue with multiple characters. I don't have a problem with two people talking to each other, yet trading dialogue with 3, 4, or 5 gets confusing. Absolutely it does. So one of the things that is great about cinema is that it's really clear who's talking because you can see them and you can hear their voice. When you're writing a novel, it gets a little bit more difficult. And it gets more difficult because you have to put said next to everything. You got to mark a lot of dialogue, and so it jumbles up the flow of the prose. It's a lot easier when you have two. Most of the time, in reality, you're only having a conversation with 2 people, maybe 3. There's only 3 people involved in a conversation. And otherwise, people are pretty quiet. So a good example, if you want one from cinema, is the opening sequence to Reservoir Dogs. In it, it's really only about the interactions between 2 characters. Mr. Pink and whoever the old guy is. And then other people just kind of having quips that go around that. But it's really a 2-part conversation with some other people adding in. And they're just kind of there for flavor. And so that's a great example. Most of the time, it's really only 2 people having a conversation. Even if there's like 5 characters there, there's 2 that are actually exchanging ideas, and the other ones are listening and responding. So that's a good way to construct any kind of scene, and I probably follow that in my books. I'm not aware of how much I do it or don't do it, but usually that's how it works. Like 2 people are having a conversation. Like if you sit down 6 people at a table, you'll have like pairs of people pairing up and talking, and other people just remaining silent and listening. This is how it is. So I would say like write your screenplays or write your stories with the same approach. With books, it does get a little bit jumbled up if you have lots of people talking. So sometimes it's good to figure out how to just have a more limited set of people. I try to have no more than like 4 or 5 named characters in a room at a time, because it gets a little bit, Lord so-and-so is sitting there. Shouldn't he say something? He's just sitting there, right? So if they're just going to sit there and not say something, maybe it's good to not have them there. If they're going to sit there and then finally at the end say like, so it is done. The king has heard your conversation and I approve of it, right? You kind of have to have them have some sort of response. And that's probably a great way to go about it. Let's go up here. As I missed a bunch. Could you do a stream purely about book openings? I already did a video on how to write your first 5,000 words, so you should check that one out. My mythological, spiritual, and other little arguments are beginning to make me question my original intent, which I think fit the story format really well. I don't know how to fix that. You work through, I understand things organically, and the mythos seems to be developing separate from my character. I've gone through that if you're gardening a lot, and sometimes it's just good to go back and throw out stuff with the mythos that you think is dumb. I've kind of done that. I've created mythologies that I just at the end decided I didn't like. And sometimes it's hard to separate the story from that. Sometimes you have to toss the story out and start over again. And it's hard to say, like, I want to start over again. But sometimes you have to. And it's not work that's lost. It's a lesson learned. And if you look at it from that, then it's like, well, I know that now I have an idea of what I'm doing and I can do it better. And I can always, each time you rewrite something, it always gets better. So I'm just going to make a better one this time. Let me see if I'm missing some stuff here. Everyone knows what a living room looks like, but how do I describe my living room? Do I only describe what is relevant to progress the story, or do I describe every little detail? I would only describe what is relevant if you're writing prose. There's no reason to do every little detail unless the detail has meaning. So, you know, if there's a picture of her grandmother on the table, that has meaning. If the picture of her grandmother on the table doesn't do anything for anyone, or she hates her grandma, or her grandma doesn't like her family, I don't know. Any detail you point out ought to have meaning. Otherwise, skip it, because it's a waste of time to read. Some people go really overboard. If you want to set the scene, you want to describe the things which evoke the most emotion in people. Anyway, if it's a throne room, you want to describe an ornate throne and some decorations. You can say, like, you know, there was in each alcove there was a statue of a saint, of a different saint, in pure, pristine white marble. Well, that sets a certain tone and tells you something about the character, and lets you know the sort of majesty of this hall, this gallery that you've entered with this king. The king's robes were crimson red and adorned with florets, right? And you're like, oh, okay, I'm getting an idea of who this king is before he speaks a line of dialogue. Now, if you stopped and you said, you know, and you can even say the marble floor had specks of gold in it or something, like, all those details set the mood of what's there. So those aren't necessarily relevant to the story, but they sure do enhance the mood. What the things that you'd want to avoid would be things that don't matter, right? It's like the lace, you know, his shirt was laced up with white thread. It's like, does that matter? Because if you point out something that's irrelevant, the reader's going to stop and notice that detail and be like, what does white thread mean? Right? I don't know what that means. Now, actually, Mark Twain, there's a part where he stitches up his shirt he keeps thread in hand to stitch his shirt back up, because his aunt has a way of making sure he doesn't take his shirt off and go swimming. But, you know, if you point it out, then there probably ought to have some meaning. Ross says hi. Hi to you. Let's see here. Let's keep going. Tertiary details can help bring your world to life. Totally. Yep. It's a great conversation you guys are having without me. It's awesome. Let me see here. How much of the world building should be outsourced because one person is likely to produce a fragile environment? I don't know how to answer that question. Yeah, I don't know how to answer that question. I wouldn't outsource it. Like, I wouldn't ask other people to do it for me. But, you know, the details that don't matter, you can just skip, you know. I don't have a heavy duty explanation of an economic system in my books. You know, people use basically denarii. You use gold, silver, and copper. And I don't need to explain how many copper there is to silver. People negotiate the prices based on that moment. You know, how much grain can I get for a denarius? It's just a silver coin. There's a reason that every culture that had access to precious metals ended up using precious metals. They're really good money. So if you're writing in a medieval fantasy, you should think about bimetallism. It's a really, really simple, easy to understand thing. People know what an ounce of silver looks like, and they have an idea of its value. It's like, you know, a denarius, which is like about a quarter ounce, should buy you like some dinner, you know, should buy you a meal or two. Super chat from Kaku. Thank you for the $5. You ever took inspiration from nature or world wonder? Times it by 2 in your world building and story crafting. How can you make it work in the story? I'm not sure what you mean by that. Ever took inspiration from nature or a world wonder like the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, times it by 2 in your world building and story crafting. How can you make it work on the story? Yeah, I'm having a hard time knowing how to answer that. Inspiration from nature. Let's just take it from that, right? Inspiration from nature could be lots of things, right? If I think about emotions, so the beauty, the beauty of the forest. And what does the beauty of the forest mean? So if I go through a deciduous forest in the fall and the leaves are all yellow, that has a particular mood and meaning to me. And so when I need that mood and that meaning in the story, I'll see if I can put it in, If you're walking through a meadow in summertime, that tends to evoke a different meaning, a different feeling than if you're walking through a forest at night. So the inspiration from nature could have a lot to do with just the setting, but also there's animals, right? So a bear is a scary thing. Well, if I want to make a really scary thing, I'm just going to make a bear times 2. Yeah. I'm going to make a bear that has no eyes and has giant tusks and will devour you whole and can sense your heat, and is also slathering poison everywhere, and doesn't die when you stick it with a spear, right? So now it's like a super bear. How does that work in the world building? Well, in the animal I just described, it would be part of some magical kind of creature, a really terrifying beast. And then why aren't these terrifying beasts everywhere? Well, they are really hard to reproduce, or they can only live in this certain environment, so you only see them there. And then you kind of hem it in, right? Like dragons might be eternal beings, but they rarely ever reproduce. So you have to think about what explains that, and then what's the consequence of that. And that kind of works for me. And as far as like world wonders, like really big architecture, I think it's great to use that to impress upon a reader or a viewer if you're doing a movie or something, or drawing a comic. Impress upon them scale, size, and what it represents to the characters. So if you draw a really big castle, a really humongous castle, boy, that's something very majestic, but it's also something impregnable. So I used a really big castle. So I basically took whatever medieval castles I could think of and kind of made them bigger and made them citadels, made them gigantic. They're Capitoline Hill, but a castle, and that's kind of how I went with it from there. And that kind of impresses upon people something large. Well, if it's something going to be large and super powerful, then the country that has it or the city that has it has to be very old and very wealthy to be making things that are that powerful, and also has to be pretty secure to make that something that powerful, and also has to have real threats to make something like that. And so all that's coming out of the world building. You have countries that are kind of perpetually in war. They need fortresses to defend. Over countless centuries, they make their fortresses stronger and stronger. You end up with sort of the arrival point of the world. Let's see if there's anything else I missed. You guys chat so quickly. Make sure if you want me to answer it specifically, if it's not a super chat, put at David Stewart, and then I'll know that you really actually want me to talk about it rather than just talking to each other. And that'll make it a lot easier because there's so much going on in the chat. It's hard for me to keep up. Another super chat from Gangi Films. How to write time travel dimensions like Chrono Trigger. I did so there's a couple ways that you can do time travel. I've done a video on time travel before. It depends which system you want to follow. So I'm trying to remember the systems that I said. There's like 12 Monkeys. There's like Back to the Future, and then there's like Terminator 2. So Terminator 2 pretty much ignores all paradoxes. So John Connor sends his own dad back in time to bang his mom and make himself and also save her from the Terminator. That's rather paradoxical, right? Because if he doesn't do that, then the future doesn't exist because the Terminator kills him, right? So he has no choice but to do that. But at the same time, in Terminator 2, they change how it goes. They destroy the chip so that Skynet can never be built. Well, wouldn't they all cease to exist if that happened? We just kind of glaze over these paradoxes in Terminator 2. In Back to the Future, they get out of this conundrum by saying, oh, well, we've created another timeline. When we did this, this person went back and created a new timeline. So when we traveled back in time, we traveled back to this other timeline. We've created like another dimension. Problem with that is that like they already had problems with paradoxes in the first movie where like his dad and mom weren't going to get together and he started like fading from existence. Paradoxes are difficult to deal with. Obviously, if he traveled back in time to where his mom was like married to Biff, he wouldn't exist as himself, right? Like he wouldn't exist. So it's a conundrum. 12 Monkeys is basically you cannot change the past. So let's tackle this question that so many lefties on Twitter seem to have a hard time answering without being awful people. Should you go back in time and kill baby Hitler? The 12 Monkeys answer would be, if you attempt to do that, you are creating Hitler. Like you can't not have Hitler because you exist in a place where Hitler exists. So any successful time travel back is only creating the present that you're time traveling from. In other words, you cannot change the present. The future and the present from which you travel cannot be changed by time travel. It's impossible. Because otherwise there'd be a paradox. In other words, you can't commit paradoxes. If you try to create a paradox, you're only making the future happen, right? That all of it's predestined and there's no free will. That's the only time travel that makes any sense to me. Is a time travel that there's actually no paradoxes because the time travel creates the present, right? Now, if you have people that are able to exist outside of time, like maybe you travel to a distant future and then you go a little bit further back. Like you're from the distant past. So nothing you do in the super future is going to create a paradox for your existence. Then you can time travel as much as you want. But if you're going anywhere into the past from where you exist, like before your birth or anything like that, then you're going to create paradoxes. So the only paradox-free time travel is like you're a dude from today and you're going to be doing time travel between 2150 and 2050. And that's how you do it. And that way there'd be no paradoxes. That's how I do it. Another super chat from Jakul. Earmarked for Roan's Lego Wet Fun. What is? Oh, Lego Get Well Fun. Oh, thank you. I got him like a little troll to play with his castles. So I have all these castles that I had when I was a boy. And so I still have all my Legos. I didn't let my mom never got rid of them. I never let my mom get rid of them. Legos were like the main toy I played with growing up. Because I love to build and rebuild stuff. And actually, Legos are a lot of inspiration for me as a kid because I created so many stories with Legos. So here's a Lego castle poster. This used to come with the Legos back in the late 80s and early 90s here. And so you can see lots of the little castles. Like I have this one and I have this one. So we built this one. And my son wanted to build it on the moon. So we built it on like a space plate. And we made it the bad guy castle. And so he takes his Legos and they fight there. And there's a giant spider that we built that lives in there. And so we got a troll set. So we built a troll monster that can live in the castle. And I think we're going to build some more old ones. I have them, they're all just pieces. So you got to go through and like find all the pieces. So it's a pain now. But he likes the knights because the knights, he creates a lot of stories with knights. And he likes the guys because he can like rip their heads off. He's like, look, the troll chopped his head off. And I'm like, dude, you're 3. And then he's like, this is a bad guy knight. And he's going to take baby sister away and lock her in the dungeon. So there's a lot of inspiration that happened with this stuff. I still have the dragon. I had the blue wizard, but I lost his hat. I've lost a lot of little things over the years from playing with him or maybe leaving him at friend's house at some point. But I had so much fun playing with the castle Legos, and I still have all the instructions because my dad would make me file them away. and on the back of this poster there's like all the other sets, you know. So you can see there's like a city set, the pirates. I have a couple pirates ones, but the castle ones were the ones I liked the best, and then the space ones I liked a lot too. So I have a couple of the space ones too. So anyway, yeah, the castle stuff, we play a lot with those. And the older sets are a lot more sturdy than the newer ones. The newer ones are very detailed and they're really cool, but they just don't stand up to like a kids playing with them. A lot of kids wanting to play and like have kids, you know, have the guys fight and really do stuff on the Legos. So the older sets are really better for that. But if you, I mean, thinking about world building, right? Like you build a castle, I built whatever castles I wanted my guys to live in with whatever features, trapdoors, secret passages, like all the stuff that you imagine as a kid. Legos can help you realize it. So I have a lot of inspiration that's happened over the years from Legos. Let me jump to the bottom of the chat and see if I can work my way up to the top. We're getting a little bit late here, so. Film Girl says, hi David, hope you're well. If you wanted to write or make a fantasy story film where mythical creatures lived with humans and some humans have abilities, how would I make it seem real? All about consequences and how the society adjusts to that. So I've read a couple books that have attempted to do this with varying degrees of success. In some cases, the attempt, you know, they had an idea for how things were, and then they really needed to abandon some of their world building halfway through the series because it just wasn't working. That happens. But you want to think like, okay, let's say you have centaurs as a mythical creature. Well, what kind of house would a centaur live in? Would he live in a house? What would his society be like? What would his interactions with people be like? What would the conflicts be like? And how would you structure relations from there? And if people have powers, how would that alter their society? So if you have like a medieval setting, medieval settings are a great, easy place to start because the technology is limited. But, you know, you don't have to do medieval. But if you're doing a medieval setting, obviously, magicians will be able to increase the technological level because they can do things that aren't normally allowed. So if they can conjure bread, then, you know, that changes a lot of things. He's a bread maker. He conjures bread all day. And that's maybe his job. If magic is a little bit more limited, then you'd have different effects. So you have to kind of think about what each effect you want to have on the world. And you can work backwards. Like, what do I want the world to look like? And then what would I put in it to make it look that way? So if you had mythological creatures just mixed in with humans, well, what do they do all day? Like, how does their society operate? Do they have an economy? What does their economy look like? If you have talking ravens, I have talking ravens in a book, but they're just like 3 talking ravens that do things basically for their own pleasure because they have no wants or cares in this world. They fly around eating dead things. And they have magic powers, and they only do things because they care to. And they don't do anything because they need to, other than like kill a rabbit and eat it. But if you have a whole society of ravens, well, boy, they're going to have to figure out how to structure themselves to make sure that they all have enough food to eat. And then how do they interact with people? Do they try to steal food from people? Well, the people would shoot the ravens out of the air. Well, then they have to come up with some sort of thing where the ravens do something for the people, and the people will give them cow flesh to eat or let them eat the dead leftover cow. I don't know. So you start with that, and then what's the consequence? And then you have a world build. And then if something is really disrupting that, you just kind of pull that thread out and see if it works again. And you can jot this stuff down on paper or just think about it, you know, however you want to do it. So that's it. It's not that hard to do. You just have to think, you just have to think about what the consequences are. Because I think it'd be great to have like mythical creatures hanging out with people. But obviously it'd be a little bit different society. Unless they're really close to you, like elves are pretty close to you. But if you have immortal elves living alongside you, boy, they might end up like your overlords or something. Unicorn on the Cob has the same poster. Awesome. I still have it. I think I'll put it up on the door or something. Cash Brown says, anytime I'm plotting a story or world building, I inevitably fuse fantasy and sci-fi together into my own personal Frankenstein. Designing magic. Is there a market for this hybrid? Hell yeah. Star Wars exists. And there's also, there's magical realism. There's techno magic. There's cyberpunk magic stuff like Shadowrun. There's all kinds of things like that. Totally a market for it. And people really dig it. And Final Fantasy 13 or Final Fantasy 7, bunch of the Final Fantasy games are just that. There's technology and magic, and they interact and they do things and whatever. But that all really comes from gameplay, not really like coherent world building. Hopefully that makes sense. Any thoughts on movies like Jupiter Ascending or Alita Battle Angel? I haven't seen it. Which tries so hard to focus on world building while having a rather mediocre, unengaging story. So you kind of have to have both, right? You want to have, for a sci-fi movie, you want to have good world building, but you really want to have a good story. The reason Star Trek is good is because the stories are good, not just because the world building's good. Let's see here. Tree Rock Creations. I have little plastic army men that I arrange in formations and create battlegrounds for reference when writing intense battle scenes. Yeah, that's fun. I've known a couple people that do that. Great example of non-humans and humans living together in a city. Perdido Street Station by China Myville. Highly recommended. Unlike any setting I've ever read. Okay, cool recommendation. I haven't read it. Jared says, if you were given the opportunity, how would you have written the Star Wars sequel trilogy? I would have followed the EU. It's already written. You just start from there and come up with a really big existential crisis for the good guys. I actually probably would have done this, as I probably would have had some repetition of themes from the first trilogy, only they resolve better. So a corrupt republic, and the problems with politics that Leia has to deal with as an old woman and like head of the republic, and a Luke that's looking for some other path to help them against this. Maybe it's an invasion from another galaxy, something really insane. That they haven't dealt with before, and then the solution is not empire, but actually fixing like the politics are finally able to you're able to keep it together. The hero is able to actually save the Republic rather than have it fall. So then you have the fall of the Republic, the restoration of the Republic, and then the test of the Republic at the end. Or I would have just gone with what George Lucas's outlines. There's some outlines that supposedly George Lucas had from back in the day. You can look up online. I have no idea if they're authentic, but they make way better stories than what we've gotten so far. So I wouldn't have been original. I would have said, George, what's the stories? And I would have just made those because they're his stories, man. And like, why would you want to deviate from it? Like the arrogance of like, we're going to throw away George Lucas's story ideas after he's done all these great stories and created all these great universes that have made literally billions of dollars. Let's throw those out because we know how to do it better these days. Jar Jar Binks is dumb. It's like, yeah, look how much better you guys did it. Eric Hutfuls. Ideas on having some select people have magical abilities, so it's rare. Yeah. Not have the magic be boots. Yeah, that's kind of how I have it. Like, mages are rare. They're really a rare thing to have a gift. So, in Needle Ash, there's 2 armies, and each of them have a small cadre of mages, like 5 to 10, that are very powerful on the battlefield. But even a weak mage can really kill a lot of people. So they become an extremely potent piece of warfare, like a big piece of artillery. And that's kind of how I used them. Do you like any of the Studio Ghibli films? I don't know which ones they are. You'd have to tell me because I don't remember, or if I've even seen them. I don't watch a lot of movies these days. Film Girl says, thanks. You're welcome. Good ways of establishing the way that the fantasy element of a story is kept secret from the normal world. Ooh. Boy, that's a good one. Men in Black does it by erasing memories, which then got copied in and J.K. Rowling. I don't know. I don't know if there's any really good ways other than what's been done. Some consequence for letting people know that magic's real. Some way of erasing memories when that fails. The way that the classic solution is that you can memory wipe people somehow. The other thing would be is like if they're kept in extreme isolation. So like if all the magical people live way out of bounds, and then the plot revolves around them coming back into the normal world. Chris Vine says, appreciate your work. Got me over several humps. Thank you. You're most welcome. The Crusader, Daysvolt. Great to catch the stream again. Do you think a story happening in a city with little to no mention of the outside world is a feasible idea? I feel it makes characters the main focus. Absolutely. Think about the way that news traveled. I mean, like, if you think about life in any period prior to the modern period, almost all news is local and has to do with local news. And only people that are, a little bit higher up are going to be having any kind of constant idea of what's going on outside the city, right? Now, news kind of goes both ways. So what would happen is someone would come into town, with some shipment of silk. Did you hear about what's happening in Florence? In Florence, the Spaniards invaded, right? And so, and then the news kind of goes both ways. It travels around. The Spaniards have gone into Florence and conquered Florence, and that's how you know about that. But that doesn't have a big impact. It's just something interesting, right? So you might hear about something like that, but most of the news you're going to hear is like, have you heard that the baker's daughter is now betrothed to the prince? Like, how did that happen? That's the stuff that really matters to people, is the everyday life. And our modern world kind of shoots a bunch. I talked about this in a video called, it's just called Noise, right? Most of what you get from the media is just noise. And I'm on Twitter. I see it. The noise wants to occupy my thoughts, but it's just noise. It doesn't mean much. So pre-modern people, because of the way information filtered, the stuff you heard from outside was the stuff that really mattered, like the Spaniards conquering Florence. Rather than, you wouldn't hear like, did you hear that the Florentines raised the price of flax? Let's trade flax futures. Like, that stuff doesn't matter, right? What matters is like who the baker's daughter's dating, Yeah, Disney and Lucasfilm really dropped the ball when they threw out George Lucas's ideas and shut him out of the franchise. Yeah, why do that? If you thought that he created $5 billion worth of value, why would you kick him out? That's so stupid, like the arrogance of that. Let me pay you $5 million to do Star Wars. No, your ideas that created this $5 million franchise are dumb. Bye. What advice would you give for handling fifth columns in a fictional setting well? I gave up on depicting one where I realized I had no chance of capturing the subtlety well. I'm not sure what fifth columns means. I don't know if I know this term. Fifth columns. Let's see here. Oh, Gangi Films Super Chat. Thank you. How to write betrayal properly. A doppelganger. How do you write betrayal properly? Do you want it to be a surprise? Figure out when the betrayal is going to happen, and then work backwards from there. So, if your character is going to be betrayed, when's the great time to betray him? You're going to betray him at some critical plot moment. Who's going to betray him? Well, whoever's going to be present that he trusts. So let's say his best friend betrays him. Okay, he's going to betray him at this part in the story. So that means prior to that, I need to drop in some hints that he's going to be betrayed him. But if you do too many hints, then people are like, oh, it's totally, this guy's a dark friend. He's going to betray you. So you have to be pretty subtle about it. And that's the tough thing, right? That's kind of execution. So I don't want to give too many plot spoilers for my own books, but I've done this before. And one of the things that you do, and in fact, I've had one betrayal that you didn't really see coming. It wasn't there to be seen coming. It was just an opportunity, and therefore it happened. And another one, I kind of set it up so that the character was acting slightly weird prior to it, and then it happened, you know. So betrayals happen when it's advantageous to do it. And the truth is, like, it's very rare to have a friend who's not going to betray you if the reward is high. I know this from personal experience in my own life. A true friend is hard to find. True friend is hard to find. Most people, if there's a significant consequence, negative consequence for them to do the right thing, they won't do the right thing. If there's a significant benefit to them doing the wrong thing, they'll do the wrong thing. Most people are sinful beings. And so, you know, if you're going to get really black-pilled, it's like if you expect everyone to betray you, you'll never be disappointed. But it's really rare that somebody, when you're in a bad situation, that they will actually do the right thing for you and not do what's good for them. And you can see this with like online communities. It's really rare that anyone will stand their ground morally. It just is. So betrayal happens in real life all the time. All you need is like a social pressure or a significant advantage for betrayal to happen, and your best friend is gonna betray you. It happens, you know. Someone says it's because Disney wants Star Wars designed from focus groups, a la TFA, like The Force Awakens. How old are you, if you don't mind me asking? You know so much, but you don't look old. It's unusual. I'm 35. My first posting in a university, I was 23. I'll give you an idea of where I'm at. So by the time I was 25, I'd already been a college professor for several years, or taught at the college level, however you want to describe it. I never had a professorship title. I was always adjunct, because that's what they do now. They don't hire any full-time faculty. So I've done a lot. You know, I've done a lot in my life. I've lived a lot of different places, tried a lot of different stuff out. I guess you have that. When I was 18, people thought I was wise. When I was young, I was already old, like a Capricorn. But I'm not. I'm a Gemini. So I'm 35. I've done a lot in that time. I would like to see the rebels take over the galaxy, replacing the Empire. Yeah, that's what happened in the... not believable they're still fighting the same fight 40 years later. No, it's not. And in the EU, that's not what it is. The conflicts are different. Big fan of your videos. Glad I could catch you live. From Grimaldus. Thank you. Thank you for joining me. I really appreciate it. 35. What's your secret? To the white beard? To what? I don't know. I don't have a secret. The secret is I tried lots of crap. I've done a lot of stuff. And, you know, I can actually look at my life and I don't want to this is going to sound like bragging, but I've been in massive different extremes in my life. And that's kind of what's colored my existence and what's taught me all the lessons that I've learned. So I've been, you know, I've played World of Warcraft for 20 hours a day before for periods of time. And I've had no video games for years at a time. I've done things where I've read like 2 books a week and things where I read no books for like a year. I've read only nonfiction for like periods of my life, or only fiction. I've lived on my own. I've lived with, I've lived in different cities. I've lived in big cities. I've lived in little cities. I've taught in different college environments, different public school environments. I've had different jobs. I've been a machinist, been a carpenter, done all kinds of ag work, been a driver, truck driver. What else? You know, I've played live. I've been playing live music since I was a kid, so that is a lot of experience getting to travel and do different things. I've been obese, and I've been like shredded to the bone. And everything in between. I know how to like build a body, and I know how to destroy a body. I've had periods of my life where I drink 10 beers a day, every single day, and periods of my life where I drink nothing, you know, and right now I don't usually really drink much of anything. There was a period in my life where I lived with 3 other dudes, and we would buy a keg of whatever beer we liked and a 13-gallon keg. And that was like a monthly thing. So we went through 13 gallons of beer a month, and then we bought a bunch of beer on top of it. So, 10 drinks a night. I probably maybe, there was only some periods where it was like 10 drinks a night. It was more like, most of the time it was like 5 or 6 beers a night for a couple years. You got tired of that, did something different. Yeah, I've been a postmodernist. I've been a classicist. I've been all over the map. I've played jazz. I've played Sinaloense banda stuff. I've done everything. So basically, whenever somebody asked me if I could do something, I said I would give it a shot, and that's how I got lots of gigs. I've been in opera, been in like rock operas, been on musicals. I've done a lot of different things. And so I've never felt like it was a problem for me to try something new or to just change myself or what I was doing. So when I decided I wanted to get out of the music business because I was tired of it, I went to writing. I was like, I'm going to be a writer. And I just did it and tried it and did everything I could with it and learned as much as I could and ended up on the other side of it with some books that I could put out and some podcasts to talk to other people who are into the same things as me, which is great. Or some live streams to talk to other people that are in the same things. So I just tried lots of different things out. Tried YouTube, abandoned YouTube for a while, went back to it, tried it again. I've done a huge amount of things. I never said that there's something I can't do. So if someone came to me and said, gave me a really good offer for something I've never done before, I'll try it out and see if I can do it, I've tried different work environments out, been for hire, been not for hire, done lots of different things. So I don't know. I've done a lot of different things, and that's how I know there's certain things that I'm not that great at, right? Like I'm not gonna be a fighter, right? MMA can get you in really good shape, but there's dudes that are on a different level athletically from what I could have ever done, even in my youth. So, but you try something like that out, and you're like, oh, I know that some people are really good at this, and I don't think I'm one of those people, And here's a picture of Nolan Ryan in the back, right? Like some people, their talent is, unapproachable. So why would you compete? Well, you try it out and see where you're at, and don't feel bad if you're not at some other people's level, And when I lived in Las Vegas, there was a lot of pro bodybuilders around. And I got to a point with my development of my body where it was like, I either need to start doing a lot of steroids or I need to change my priorities, because I'm doing all the workouts, but I'm like I was never like a skinny dude, but like, I can't look the way I want to look without drugs after this. I've already reached like what my body can do in a couple of years of hard work and like perfect diet, which perfect diet's exhausting. So there's a reason that like as soon as I got married, like my weight started going back up. It's like, can I just have like one piece of cake? I haven't had cake in 6 months, or having only boiled chicken breast with no salt. It's like, oh, you get tired of that. So you reach a point where it's like, I'm either going to do the bodybuilder lifestyle or I'm not. And I'm like, I'm not. Because I don't think I have the genetics to compete. So if I don't have the potential to be the best or to at least like be top tier, then I'm not going to do it, And I look at my body and when I was in good shape, like my body wasn't bad, but I could see that I didn't have the genetics to be Jay Cutler or someone like that. It just didn't. So no reason to go down that path. You try it out and you take it to the limit that you want to take it, and then you decide how far you're going to go with that. If you think I look young at 35, I don't know what to tell you. I've looked the same for like 20 years. I'll tell you that much. I remember I went to audition for like wind ensemble when I was 18 and going to college. And I remember whoever was making me audition was like, what made you want to go back to school? I'm like, it was August. He thought I was like 30 and I was like 18. So, it's one of those things. Anyway, let's see if I missed any stuff. Paleo diet works pretty well. Cut grain, sugar, dairy. I can't change my lifestyle for that. Yeah, it's a lifestyle that I mean, it's already I already live pretty close to paleo anyway, but like, grains tend to be the thing that gets cut. But I'm Dutch, man. I'm not cutting dairy out of my diet. Get out of here. Like, that's the only thing we eat. Well, might as well ask me to not enjoy life at that point, Actually, I'd say the best diet that worked for me was like really, actually pretty dairy heavy. I tolerate dairy. Some people are lactose intolerant and like can't do dairy. I can do as much dairy as I want to. The problem was, dairy has a lot of sugar in it. So it's hard to have a lot of dairy and then not have a lot of sugar. So paleo diet works great for some people. Some people love it. My brother-in-law basically does like a ketogenic diet and he really likes it, but it's a lifestyle change, man. It's a different lifestyle. And for me, if I eat the same thing every day, if I have a good meal plan, I can still enjoy those meals and make them reasonably pretty good and have some of the meals with my family too. So dinner I can have with my family and have it be a little bit different and I can enjoy it. But I can't do, and because I'm, my focus is just like, I want to be fairly healthy. I don't need to be like razor sharp. Paleo diet's it's a little bit too much for me. Not that it's bad. It works great for some people. So do what works great. If eating bison steaks every day and vegetables is like what you enjoy and that makes you feel great, that's awesome. Because it's gonna turn you into a beast. You're eating like a beast, you're gonna look like a beast. But whatever, do what's gonna work good for you. I'm not a dietitian. I'm just a guy who lost 100 pounds at one point. And by the way, like most of the weight that I lost, I gained a bunch of weight just from drinking beer, right? So six beers at like 200 calories. It's 1,200 calories a day of nothing, of garbage. Right? You're going to get super fat drinking a lot of beer. And that's exactly what happened. This is something from Unicorn on the Cob. I believe you heard you say you're a voluntarist, but as the scope of society gets smaller, like local, you get more, I don't remember the word, but more in favor of regulation. So I don't like to use the word regulate. Well, regulation can happen a bunch of different ways, right? But structure, I would say I'm a localist, right? Which structure is the most structured as close to you are, and then it goes out from there. And your allegiances, the further they go out, the less structure there needs to be. So at the national level, I'm a libertarian, right? I don't, national drug prohibition, national taxes, we don't, the only thing that really should be happening at the federal level is like military spending and those things which, a federal court system, obviously, to handle disputes between citizens of different states, things that actually affect everybody. Not nationalized health insurance, not nationalized wealth. No, that's nonsense. There's no way that you can structure something from Washington and have any kind of backwards talk from somebody out in like rural California or Wyoming. Inevitably, you end up in what we have now is really an imperial system. So at the national level or I shouldn't say the national level. At the federal level, I'm a libertarian. The state level, I'm really a Republican, right? So, you need to build roads. You need to manage crime. At the local level, I'm probably closer to Democrat. I tend to get more in people's business. I don't want companies running roughshod over me, putting poison in my water for no reason. I want to regulate where people can build sewage treatment plants and things like that. I'm not into anarchy at the local level because then that really it becomes chaos and it doesn't create what people really want, which is something structured, right? People want more structure the closer you get. And by the time you get to the family, I'm a socialist, right? Like we have one pool of money that we spend money out of, and the social bonds that bind us keep us from spending that money poorly. You go to a federal level and you have socialism. There's no binding on the money, right? There's no one to actually impress upon that sort of government how they ought to spend money. It's completely oppressive and like theft. But my wife wouldn't classify me spending part of her paycheck on something that we need as theft, right? Even though I didn't I guess it's voluntary, right? Obviously, but it's not theft. So as you get closer, things get more structured. So at the local level, things get pretty structured, right? You have a a system for how you want people to act, like what's illegal, what's not illegal. I think it's okay for localities to make it a crime to be publicly intoxicated, right? So I don't want drunk people walking around on the street. I want to be able to walk down the street without my kids having to deal with somebody who's high or drunk. And so if somebody's high or drunk, I want them off the street in their home where I don't, where it's their own business. Obviously, their structure can be inside their home, but if they're out on the street, then it's like I want them off the street. Go throw them in the drunk tank. I don't want that. I don't want people like doing drugs at my park. No me gusta, right? But I'm not going to tell a town in Wyoming that they can't have that. So if there's a town in Wyoming that's like, we all like drugs here, and we're going to make it so you can do drugs out in the open. I'm like, that is your town. And if I come to your town, I will respect your laws and your ways, and I will not countermand them. But in my town, I don't like drunk people walking around. I don't like it. Oh, I missed the super chat. Gengi Films. Tips on music for world building in films and games. I don't know what music for world building means. Yeah, I don't know what that means. Like a world, like the music in the world. I think that's what you mean. Like what kind of music they have. Well, if you look worldwide at the U.S., or not the U.S., the world, if you look worldwide in our world, you see that there's a very limited number of instrument types. There's instruments that use strings. There's instruments where you blow air into them. You sing, that's an instrument, or you hit something. Those are kind of like the four instrument types. And it's been forever since I've done like music history, so I don't remember the four types. Strings, and then there's plucked strings and bow strings, right? So in China, they have bowed strings like a violin, but they're a Chinese instrument. There's Chinese lutes. There's Japanese lutes. They're all basically a cultural variation of the same prime idea of, a guitar. So there's of a guitar. So if you have a culture that this is obviously not plugged in. This is my Hello Kitty, right? How you describe the music is going to be what you really want to think about. Just as an example, in Dune they have an instrument that's like a 10-string lute, and for the movie they used a Chapman stick because it was kind of an exotic instrument that people hadn't seen a lot of, and so they have, like, Patrick Stewart I think is playing like a Chapman stick. So you can have things like that, and that's one where you are hammering you're hammering the strings with your fingers. So it's kind of a different tone than something like this. So you think about how the instrument's played, and you go from there. So if it's a stringed instrument, like, the more strings, obviously the bigger the range. So if I go get my Baroque lute out, it has 24 strings. This one only has 6. So 6 strings has a little bit more narrow range than something else. So as you think about what instrument you want to have, you think about what the person's doing. He's playing a lute, and he's singing, and the lute has many strings, and he's hammering the strings maybe instead of plucking the strings. He's hammering the strings to produce whatever melody he's trying to produce. And so all of a sudden you've created kind of a unique instrument that requires 2 hands and has a different expression. And then you need to learn, if you're writing prose, you want to learn some words that have to do with music that color it. He played with a very wide vibrato maybe, or he played very softly and subtly. You don't have to know, just words that lay people are going to know and be able to understand. Like, you wouldn't want to say like he entered a marcato section. Like, a lot of lay people would be like, what's marcato? What does that mean? And he entered a section where he played strong connected notes. Oh, I know, I can imagine what that would sound like, So you start from there, and maybe it's a drum. And so if you imagine a band, like even in Star Wars, the band is playing like clarinets and drums and guitars. It's playing the same crap we play here. but their own way that they come about it. So it's its own form. It could have a decoration here. It could have a dragon head like carved on the headstock. It could have a cartoon kitty under the strings. Whatever thing expresses the culture. Obviously, this would be like kind of a Japanese thing, right? But you go from there. And that's a great way to do it. So if you wanted to be more exotic, think of an exotic way of playing it, like the drum is maybe played by scratching with your fingernails, right? That'd be an interesting thing. Think of like what you have normally and add a couple things that just change it. Do you ascribe more to a Platonic or Aristotelian outlook? How can one apply those views to world building? Well, you can read my books and see the Platonic one. So, I don't think they're incompatible. So an Aristotelian outlook is one that's mostly deductive, and with a little bit of induction, right? The focus is on what you can prove, and that your senses are correct. And I don't believe in like the more extreme ideas of a Platonic outlook, like your senses deceive you or you're unable to understand much of reality. But the truth is you can't comprehend all of reality. You can only comprehend a small part of it. The big thing that gets me about Plato, and that I come back to again and again, is the idea of concepts being a thing unto themselves. And words are things that we use to communicate and to access concepts. And the way that we access and construct those concepts and communicate those concepts imparts meaning to those concepts and can be altered in nefarious ways. So if I ask someone to describe Donald Trump, a typical person who watches a lot of CNN is going to come up with words. I'm like, what are the first words that come to mind to describe Donald Trump? They'll come up with a bunch of stuff. They'll be like misogynist, orange, like they'll come up with these things that are just attached to the concept. Now, Donald Trump exists regardless of how you would describe him. So as a concept, Donald Trump is a thing unto himself. But how we communicate who Donald Trump is, we do through a very complex network of concepts. And which concepts we use to try to access Donald Trump colors what we think Donald Trump is. So our perception of the real thing is colored by how we get there. Always. So if I say, I've done this with my students before, I'm like, what's a chair? What's a chair? Oh, it's a thing you sit on. I'm like, okay, well, here's a rock. Is a rock different from a chair? Oh yeah, a rock is a rock, but a chair is something that man made. Oh, so it's who made it changes it. So all of a sudden you have this concept, it's man-made, and you sit on it. Boom, two things. And then it's like, well, it has legs that hold you off the ground. Okay, what are legs? I have legs. Oh, these are analogous to legs. These are pegs that act like legs. They're not really legs, but we're using the word legs to access this thing which actually exists that looks like a leg, right? And then I'm like, okay, is that it? What if I just have a platform with legs? They're like, that's a stool. That's different from a chair. A chair has a back. Oh, so it has a thing that you can lean back, and it's got something that goes on the floor and keeps you off the floor, and that's a chair, right? And so we have all these concepts that we use to access it. But a chair is a thing. The chair is a thing that exists regardless of how you use to describe it. The problem is, for you to interpret reality, you're making these connections. So my magic system has to do with your ability to perfectly, as in your mind, understand a concept. Because the concept represents a building block of reality. Out of reality is built by these pure concepts that exist in this Fey realm, the pure concept realm. And as we go into the mundane world where things are fixed and in place and immutable and not subject to the concept. Another, the concept doesn't define the thing is defined by concepts in the real world, right? Concepts are used to describe things. But in the world of concepts are a thing unto themselves. So as you go and from the magical to the mundane, your ability to understand the magical has to do with your ability to understand concepts. So simple concepts are the things which are irreducibly simple. Fire. Fire is fire. Fire is fire is fire. It's a chaotic thing, but like, there's no other way to describe fire really other than fire. You're like, well, there's flames and heat. You're like, no. You're describing what fire does. Fire is fire. Same thing with light. Light is light. And you can add things to it. Red light. Blue, here's a blue light. I have a blue light here. You can see the blue, right? And I have a red light over here. That's why I look kind of like I'm on stage. So you're adding things. Blue is a concept. Light is a concept. So you can only understand the things which are like at the very core of a concept. And that's kind of how I built it. I don't think they can't be in opposition because you cannot understand the world. It's too complex. So you need concepts to navigate the world, which means if our concepts are able to use to navigate the world, then there must be a conceptual reality as well. There's something above and beyond what we see, where things are themselves, because our minds transmit these concepts, and we use the concepts to transmit ideas. So I don't think they're in opposition. I don't think that like our senses are not to be believed, but I don't think Plato believed that either. Okay, sorry, let me move on. Film Girl says, I currently work in a cinema after finishing my film degree, and I feel like I'm going nowhere in life. None of my friends will make films with me, but I think you're very inspirational. Well, thank you. This is a conundrum that I have faced in my own waking life. Not just making films, because I've written screenplays, and in order to get a screenplay, it's like, someone please make this for me. But trying to like tour in a band or just play music in a band, I got to get other people that aren't as committed to my ideas as I am, and it's really hard. So I think it's really rare to get it like a band together. I mean, the reason that bands are full of such losers is that they're the only people who have time to play in a band. It's like Motley Crue. If they weren't Motley Crue, would be like dead in the gutter, and would be total losers. And there's probably, for every Motley Crue, there's like 1,000 people who are total losers and played in a band. But Motley Crue happened to make it big. It's because they just didn't have that much else to do. It's really rare to find other people that are as committed to anything that you are. And film, unfortunately, is one of those things where it's pretty much impossible to have all the mastery available to you to where you can make a film on your own. And there's a bunch of different obstacles. The first one is money, right? You either got to have a lot of good friends or you got to have money. So if you have a lot of money, well, then you can hire people to do all the things you can't do, and you can make your film. Most people don't have money. They don't just have money sitting around. So you got to go to someone and be like, you have money, will you finance my film? And they're like, well, is it going to make me money? How are you going to make me money? So now you have to have like business people to help you make money, or have a really good idea of business. So you have to have a path to making money. Otherwise you can't make the movie. And if you didn't have a path, you could only make the movie once if you had the money. So you gotta be able to make money on it. You need actors, they either need to be paid or they have to be your friends. And if they need to be paid, you need the money. And if they're your friends, chances are they're not very good. Let's be honest, right? We love our friends not because they're good actors, but because they're our friends. You need music. You need cameras and equipment, microphones. You need computers and the knowledge for how to edit them. You need someone to run a camera if you're going to act, or actors to act while you run a camera. You need all these things. You need someone to write the music. You need someone to do the sound engineering work. You need someone to do editing. If you're not going to, you could probably do editing yourself. So as I go through it, like, what are the things you can do yourself? Well, like, you can own the equipment. You can shoot the movie. You can edit it yourself. You probably can't do the music yourself unless you're someone like me and you are already trained in music, or you have a long career in music already, because it's very difficult to compose a film score if you've never done it. Okay. It's not easy to compose music, and there's a lot of training. And that's one of the reasons that film scores aren't as good anymore, is I feel like colleges don't teach the skills. So there's a much smaller talent pool of people who can actually do it. Those are the things you can do, but you can't act all the parts yourself unless you're doing animation. So the only thing where you could do everything yourself is animation, where it's possible, because otherwise you need actors, right? So if you're not doing that, you have to have other people. And this is a big problem with music, getting other people to play with you. So my solution was to do things that didn't require other people. So maybe think about animation, because you could probably do it all yourself. You'd have to learn how to draw and how to write music. But I think the guys who did Homestar Runner were like 2 dudes. So that's something successful. I think Trey Parker and Matt Stone did their first South Park, just the two of them. So if you can find one other person, it makes it a lot easier. Heroes of Mighty Magic 3. Couldn't the market regulate companies better than the government at the local level? Nope. Well, yeah, but no. Depends what you mean by regulate. So for things that matter to that market, yes. Right. Now I'll just give you an example. Like regulating alcohol sales. What does the market regulating alcohol sales mean? Well, a store that sells alcohol needs to be motivated to not sell alcohol to people that the community doesn't want alcohol sold to them. So they're either going to do it through social pressure or through government. Social pressure is preferable because it doesn't require government, right? It doesn't require that stuff. So if there's just strong enough social pressure to not sell to minors, you don't need the government to do that at all. But you still have a structure, right? There's still some governance there. There's still other people kind of imposing their wishes on you. You would like to sell as much alcohol as possible, but you also don't want Jim down the street to be really mad at you. And you don't want to have your lease suddenly get canceled because you sold alcohol to minors and your landlord doesn't like that. So you don't need government at the local level, but the market doesn't necessarily regulate itself. The market does regulate itself where there's sufficient competition. When you get down to the local level, sometimes there's no competition, which is fine, right? There's like, who's going to fix the roads? Well, either all your neighbors pitch in to fix the road, or all your neighbors pitch in and pay a government to fix the road. Sometimes the government, like my local government, pretty much just does water, sewer, trash, and fixes roads. That's all it does. And that's like taxes are, other than the education taxes are really from the state, but the local taxes, government's pretty small locally. But at the same time, I want bad guys to get locked up, What actually regulates companies really good is torts. Far better than government, because torts, there's someone who's actually injured, hopefully, unless it's like completely bad. You have common law, which is very adaptable and can see to every single little detail of a consequence and actually see that whether people are at fault. And then you have actual compensation, right? Rather than somebody getting locked up for parking in the wrong place, or something else that harms another person. The person who's harmed gets paid. Like tort laws really do that. And so companies have an incentive to not have torts, which means they have incentive to not make products that blow people up, all these sorts of things. Whether it's at the local level or the national level, tort law does a much better job than government. I know tort law is very unpopular. Part of that is because there's a lot of corporate propaganda that says tort law bad, but tort law does a lot of good in our society and does a lot of good in other cultures as well, to regulate companies through financial incentives and actual consequences to things that they're liable for, rather than having to have the government say no, yes. So the government doesn't have to regulate it, but that doesn't mean that there's not structure. Do you see Bernie Sanders' face when Trump said America would never be a socialist country? I didn't watch the State of the Union address. Sorry. It's just noise to me. I don't care about it. It's not that I don't care about what happens, but the words don't matter. I only care about the actions. Thoughts on naming characters? What a great question. I got to go after a couple of these questions here because I'm way out of time. Thoughts on naming characters, places, etc. using play on words or inspired by translated words? I think that's fine. I just look at like, what do names sound like? And then just pick names that sound like names. You can make them up. Malo. Sounds like a name, right? Malo actually, I think, means something in Spanish. I don't remember what. Bad or something, right? So you just can name stuff like that. But you can do play on words. Like, there's lots of different ways to do naming characters. And then sometimes you just choose familiar names. I choose names that people, for main characters that people will be able to pronounce. Like Luke Skywalker's name is Luke. That's a name from here and now. But it's an easy one, right? So names that people can get really attached to. Names are just common. They get reused over and over again. Mortal Kombat is the best video game movie adaptation? No. You're not going to explain the presence of the Hello Kitty guitar? I have one. It's there. It exists. All right, let me see another one here. David Stewart could do it because he writes his own stories and music. Yeah, he has what Scott Adams calls a skill stack. Muramasa audiobook with custom music would be sick. I could do that. I'm going to put out audiobooks this year of a lot of those books if I can get around to it. The problem with music would be I couldn't put it on Audible. Can't have background music. I might add some background music to the Garmish and the Farmer one, though. How would you indirectly expose a monogendered world with humanoid creatures? Like all are either women or men, but the concept of the other doesn't exist. Just show attraction to everything. They're all attracted to each other. You know, there's no male or female. And then think of you could easily think of a pronoun that doesn't say he or she. Like, or just use the same one. Everything's a she or everything. Yeah, I would say everything's a she. I would choose, if I was going to choose he or she, I'd choose she. Because people are, this is going to sound funny, people are less offended by lesbians than gay men. And that's the first thought that they're going to have is a bunch of lesbians and they're like, hot. I don't know. But you could do Z or something that's different. Or they. Everybody's they. But I might choose one so that you could actually have the plural. And people will figure out very quickly that there's no gender, you know, or have characters engage in some sort of reproductive act that you can make it clear that they don't have different sexes, that they're hermaphroditic. All right, I think that's going to have to be it for tonight because I'm really over time. Thank you for joining me tonight and for all the questions. I'm sure I missed some because there's so much chat towards the middle that it's hard to keep up with it all. If I missed a super chat, I think I got all the super chats. I really appreciate the super chats. If I missed a super chat, I'm very sorry, and I'll get to it next time. From now on, if you put at me, you know, at David Stewart, you put my name, then it draws my attention to it, and I know that you're talking to me and not responding to another comment, and that'll keep it a little bit cleaner. Anyway, guys, thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. I do have the ebook of the Needle Ash Complete is coming out this week. You can buy the paperback right now. It looks just like this, but it doesn't have this stripe. This is not for resale. This is like a proof copy. You could be an advanced reader copy or something when I do these in the future. So all this is going to be reorganized into like an actual series. So this cover will get redesigned, or I'm sorry, Water of Awakening will get redesigned. So there'll be a number 1 here. It looks like this. And so this is what the book 1 will look like. And I did a slight redesign of this last year. And then this is what book 2 will look like. Like this. And there'll be a little novella coming out first on Subscribestar, and then going out wide. If you're on my mailing list, eventually you'll get a free copy of it, just to let you know. But for my Subscribestar people, I'm trying to make some good exclusive content. And then that'll go on sale for like 99 cents. Yeah, and then I have more books planned. Hopefully come up with some audiobooks, and I do appreciate it, the attention. So feel free to pre-order that on Amazon. I'll have, maybe I'll put a link right now. And you can buy shirts too. I have the shirts for sale, the Scipio Africanus shirt, the Zool shirts. You can buy Memories Adrift from me, Zool, the band Zool, which is me plus whatever guests I want to have on. So you can check that out. And if you, by the way, if you read the entire Eternal Dream set, I would appreciate it if you reviewed the full book. It's really not that different, but I probably need some reviews on it. Eventually, the smaller books I'm going to phase out. It was an interesting experiment. I could talk about it some other time, but I don't think I'll repeat it. I think I'm going to forge my own path. Write longer books the way that I like to write them, and the way I think classic fantasy readers like to read them. So, thanks, guys, and I'll see you all next time.